I'm Dr. Karl, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. G'day, Dr. Karl, Shirtloads of Science, and today I'm talking with somebody who can do something to cattle where you feed them small amounts of some sort of seaweed and you can help reduce global warming from methane by some enormous percent. I don't know the exact numbers. Did I get that right, Mr. Sam Elson? Is that right?
That's correct, Dr. Karl. By feeding a tiny dietary inclusion of a red seaweed that's native to Australia called Asparagopsis, we can virtually eliminate methane emissions from ruminant livestock like cows and sheep.
Firstly, the name of the seaweed?
Asparagopsis.
Secondly, what percentage of their feed do the cattle have? Because they just sit out there, they walk around turning grass into muscle, which I find totally amazing. What percentage of their feed do you have to have as seaweed? Like, is it 5%?
Just 0.2, between 0.2 and 0.5% of the animal's diet. So they might eat anywhere from like 10 to 20 kilograms of feed a day. Just 0.2% of that is this special seaweed.
So is it like a gram or something? I can't do the numbers in my head.
It's grams. It's between about 20 and 50 grams.
And then it will reduce their methane emissions out of their mouth and or bum, but out of the body of the cow by some magically high percentage?
Yeah, so we see in vitro assays and like controlled environments, we can get up to 98% reductions, but in the commercial world, it's more like around 80 to 90%.
Now, tell us about carbon dioxide and methane and their propensity for trapping heat in the atmosphere and so forth.
Often, Dr. Karl, when we talk about climate change, we're always talking about carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, but there are other greenhouse gases having an enormous impact on our planet's warming, and one of those is methane. So methane is the second most abundant greenhouse gas in our atmosphere, but interestingly, because it has the 4 hydrogens and the carbon, it holds heat at 84 times that of carbon dioxide. In the first year that it's emitted into the atmosphere, it's 120 times that of carbon dioxide. But what's interesting is it's a short-lived atmospheric gas, so it's a fantastic opportunity when it comes to our climate goals. But also, as a gas, a lot of people don't know is that it's actually increased over the last century by 120% versus carbon dioxide, which is actually a little bit less.
Wow. So molecule for molecule, in the short term, how much more heat does methane trap compared to carbon dioxide?
120 times that of carbon dioxide.
And then over the first decade or so?
So that goes to about 84 times. And then when we compare gases against carbon dioxide in terms of their global warming potential, or GWP, methane is then reduced down to 28 times. So even though methane isn't actually in our atmosphere for 100 years, it's compared against carbon dioxide, which has an atmospheric half-life of 100 years. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas, but is measured against a greenhouse gas that's in the atmosphere for a lot longer than it is. So that's why we get methane having, according to the United Nations, 28 times the warming effect of carbon dioxide.
So grass is basically 3 atoms, carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, and a tiny amount of nitrogen for their protein. What does the cow do to this grass, and what gases come out of the cow's body and where?
Cows obviously are consuming that organic matter, as you say, and then that's broken down in their rumen through their digestive system. So they have 4 stomachs, but one of the largest of those stomachs acts like a gas chamber where they undertake a process called enteric fermentation. So that is basically a byproduct of that digestive process is these greenhouse gases that are produced. So methane is about 90% of that gas, and it's burped out actually. So 95% of the gas or the methane produced by these animals comes out of burps and only about 5% out of the farts. So 95% comes out the front end and 5% out of farts.
How many stomachs do they have?
4 stomachs, so they're ruminants, so they ruminate essentially as a part of their digestion, and the digestive process that's happening within the rumen is one which is called enteric fermentation. So it's a process of fermenting the food that they're consuming, and it's that process that creates the methane. So the carbon which comes from the organic matter that they're consuming is then joined by 4 hydrogens, which makes the CH4, and that gas is then burped out.
Now, you're saying that by adding 0.2% of their diet is this seaweed. What's the name of the seaweed again?
Asparagopsis. So it's a red native seaweed to Australia. It happens to grow abundantly around Tasmania, but there's a temperate and a tropical variety of the seaweed. So we've got it all around the Barrier Reef and the northern parts of Australia, and then all the way around Tasmania and South Australia and parts of southern WA as well.
By adding this tiny percentage, this chemical process gets, subverted, changed. So Can you run us through what happens to the carbon atoms so that instead of getting married to 4 hydrogen atoms and coming out as methane, tell me more, Dr. Sam.
So basically, by including this diet, seaweed into the diet of the animals, it reacts with enzymes through that enteric fermentation, that digestive process, and converts that which would have been expelled into the atmosphere as a gaseous, methane or greenhouse gas, into energy which they are able to use to produce either milk or meat. And that chemical pathway really is that the carbon, specifically, that would have had the 4 hydrogens attached and gone out the mouth, is then converted into a long-chain fatty acid, what the animal uses for energy to create milk and meat. So we have an increase in productivity. That's super important. So we have this positive environmental outcome, and then we have this amazing increase in productivity that's important.
I mean, part of the problem is that we foolishly see the environment as worth nothing. A river that you can swim in and get fish is, in commercial terms, worth the same as a river that catches on fire and there's no fish, and if you come near it'll burn your flesh and you have to spend $500,000 in your town to get an Olympic swimming pool. So there actually is a gain in productivity for the cow, so you can use that as a way to get the farmers to go down this pathway?
Yeah, that's right. So we get an increase in what they call feed conversion efficiency, or genuine just productivity gain, so the animal growing slightly faster. Basically, our goal with our technology is to try to get the cost of the seaweed and our product to be lower than the productivity gains, in order to be able to, as you say, drive adoption and incentivise farmers to take this up. Because I think one of the really important things is, whilst the concentration of carbon in our atmosphere continues to increase despite the fact that we've had a Paris Climate Agreement signed for over 10 years, reducing emissions is voluntary.
Okay, let's go back to seaweed. I'm kind of imagining it's not as though you wake up in the morning, spend half the morning having a cup of coffee and doing some gentle yoga or something, and then you lay out a ground sheet and then seaweed falls out of the sky and then you mail it off to the farms. I'm guessing it's possibly more complicated than that?
Just a little bit more complicated than that. Yeah, we have operations on the east coast of Tasmania, so we set up in a place where we knew the seaweed was annually abundant. We set about initially growing the seaweed on land and in the ocean. And why we took a two-pronged approach, well, really because we just didn't know which was going to work. There was no handbook on how to do this. We had collaboration between a number of different universities in Australia, so lots of hands on deck helping us close the knowledge gaps. We had to observe the seaweed and understand this really complicated life history that the seaweeds have, and the mix of environmental variables that trigger reproduction. So understanding how the seaweed can reproduce so that we can produce spores, so that we can have stock to farm. We then had to figure out what is the infrastructure that we need to grow the seaweed. So we grow backbone, or like a rope that's submerged 6 metres below the surface in the ocean. The seaweed is attached to ropes, so seaweed spores are attached to the ropes, and they grow into full-blown plants over about 10 weeks. So it's very, very quick. It's only about a 30-centimetre crop. We then harvest that and process it into our product, which we call seafeed. But then we also grow the seaweed on land in these ponds. And for that, we grow a different life phase of the seaweed. So I mentioned that it has an interesting life history. The seaweed has a life phase where there are male and female plants. That is what we grow out in the ocean. Under certain environmental conditions, the male plant germinates the female. She produces reproductive fruits called sister carps.
Hang on. You said plants, because everybody thinks of seaweeds as plants, and I always thought of them as plants, but then you said the magic word spore. Are you implying that, in fact, seaweed is not a plant?
That's correct. Seaweed is not a plant. It is actually,
seaweed is not a plant.
It is not a plant. It is actually an algae of the algae family. So there's micro and macro algae, and seaweed is what you would regard as macro algae.
Okay, so you got this seaweed, which is an algae, not a plant. Okay, so that's blowing my mind. So much I'm learning from you today. And then you got these male and female plants.
The male plant germinates the female, and that she produces reproductive fruits, which are called sister carps, which under certain environmental conditions will release spores. So that spore release is the end of that sort of specific life phase.
Are you doing that at the moment in the ocean or in your tanks?
In a land-based lab, actually. Mm-hmm. So we've had to take what happens in nature and replicate it on land-based laboratories. So basically mimicking nature, and we use temperature-controlled cabinets to basically mimic what's happening.
Can you get enough output, bearing in mind that you can't afford to have several hundred square kilometres of seaweed growing inside a lab? I'm guessing they make heaps and heaps of eggs and spores?
They do, thousands if not millions. Yeah, so from a tiny cell you can have a huge amount of spores. Those spores are then settled onto ropes which go out via our boats out into the marine lease. So we have an 1,800 hectare marine lease, so a very large body of water.
And how far out from the shore is it, like 1 metre or a kilometre? And what happens when big storms come and all that sort of stuff?
So we're really lucky. It's 15 minutes by boat. It's in about 20 to 30 metres of water. And so the structures are submerged 6 metres below the surface. So they're sort of in the water column, not on the bottom and sort of not on the top. And we're lucky in the fact that we have the protection of Maria Island, so a beautiful island that can protect us from those large southerly swells.
So what are the things that are growing on these ropes? We're now into another phase.
It's a filamentous seaweed that grows into mature plants over a very short time frame, and then we have boats that go out. We hook the lines up onto davits on our boat, and the seaweed is more or less vacuumed off and then comes back to our facilities for processing.
And what do you do with that seaweed? Do you reuse it? Do you chuck it back in the ocean? Do you turn it into sushi?
So a portion of it is certainly harvested, and then we process it into our feed, and then a little bit is then used to reseed the line so we can actually grow the seaweed again.
Can you give me the timescale? When was the research done, published? You guys kicked into action, all that sort of stuff?
So the foundational science behind this was actually discovered by the CSIRO as part of the National Livestock Methane Program. It was a collaboration between MLA, James Cook University and the CSIRO.
MLA?
Meat and Livestock Australia. The CSIRO knew very early on that this methane was a massive issue, and that livestock are actually responsible for about 75% of our agricultural emissions.
What? Say that again?
Livestock production is responsible for about 70 to 75% of our agricultural emissions.
Carbon dioxide or methane or both?
Both, but predominantly methane.
CSIRO wrote about it in 2012 and then?
Published a paper on this in 2016, and we then started the company. I learned about this and was inspired by an Australian of the Year, Professor Tim Flannery, around the possibilities of seaweed, and was really excited about what we could do in Australia to build a new industry that was environmentally positive. But then we had this thought, what are you going to do with all the seaweed if you grow it? So looking for innovations around seaweed and just stumbled on the work that was happening by the CSIRO, and that became the ticket for us to be able to capture carbon through photosynthesis that happens in the ocean as we grow seaweed, but also be able to have an amazing way to support sustainable agriculture.
So with the system that you've got running at the moment, I'm guessing you're still in sort of startup phase and you haven't bought your first private helicopter or first jet yet?
No private helicopters and certainly no jets. It's been a very much a team effort. We've got amazing scientists working on our team, and we've come a long way. I feel like we're those amazing mountaineers that scale El Capitan, and we're kind of just taking it one, grasp at a time. And I think that even though it feels like we've still got a long way to get to the top, you turn around and look down, you're quite a way up. So that journey has for us meant, starting firstly understanding the life cycle of seaweed, being able to replicate it, building out these assets that can support the cultivation and supply of the product. We've also had to do a number of animal studies to replicate what was done by the CSIRO. There's now over 40 peer-reviewed published papers, and we've supported about 15 of those. And also working with the actual industry. We're working with farmers to make it really, really easy. So we've developed salt lick blocks, that animals in grazing.
What is this salt lick block of which you speak?
It's a way in which grazing cattle can be supplemented with the nutrients that they need. So they've got things like phosphorus or urea or other things, molasses that they feed them, salt, so they have minerals supplements. So this is something that a lot of farmers already use. We've worked really closely over 2 years with a partner to be able to mix our seaweed evenly through this block so that when the animals lick, they're getting some of our supplement. So we've tried to make it really easy for the farmers, and I guess we've got to a point now where we have the capacity to feed around 10% of Australia's livestock. So it's massive impact potential, but now our work is really in how do we drive adoption from farmers in a voluntary space.
You can supply enough to reduce emissions in 10% of all the cattle in Australia. 10%?
Yeah, it's a massive number.
How many people are employed in total in your giant megaplex company? Like, is it 100 or 1,000 or 10,000?
We have about 60 employees in the business. So we started from 2 people, collaboration between universities, to now having 60 employees across the East Coast. of Tasmania. We're a regional business, but we also have 2 sites. So we bought another land-based site with 660 swimming pools. It used to be an abalone farm. We use the seawater from the ocean to grow a different life phase of the seaweed, but that's also a really exciting way that we think we can take this technology to other parts of the world, utilising a similar water profile to be able to grow this like in Europe and the US, South America, and places where they have much greater numbers of livestock.
I'm just totally astonished that with 60 people, you can reduce emissions among 10% of Australia's cattle. OMG.
It's amazing. But I mean, we've got such an incredible team, amazingly dedicated individuals who are far smarter than I am.
Okay, so now I'm going to use that wanky management cliche. What's the call to action, Dr. Sam?
Well, I think we've got amazing technology coming out of Australian science that being developed, in the east coast of Tasmania and building new skills to support sustainable agriculture. We really need to embrace it. I'd love to see, more farmers using our product, and also to be able to show the rest of the world what a difference you can make, but also how easy it can be. We're working with a number of farmers. So there's a burger chain grilled. You can buy a low emissions burger, Dr. Carl, and you can also find low emissions milk from Eco Milk in a company called Ashgrove in Tasmania, a family owned dairy. And all of these things have been embraced by Australians. But we need a lot more. So, a call out there, I guess the call to action is Australians with farms, get in touch with us. Let's collaborate and create great outcomes.
What an amazing coincidence that you led into the final question I was going to ask you. How can people get in touch with you?
People can get in touch with us through the website. So it's www.seaforest.com.au, and also through our social media, particularly Instagram, where it's Seaforest Australia.
Okay, so go to the website and take it from there. Look, thank you so much, Dr. Sam Elson, E-L-S-O-M, and your company is called?
Seaforest.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sam.
Thank you, Dr. Carl.
Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun and aired by the University of Sydney.